Quico Toro, welcome aboard Bendiksen Airways.
Good fun to be here.
Do we have a climate crisis?
We do, but it's nothing compared to the one our great grandchildren are gonna have. Yeah.
Why? What makes you say
Well,
that?
um, I I feel like in the last 15 years, there's been a big emphasis in the climate movement in making the climate crisis feel well like a crisis, like something that's really right here, right now, breathing down your neck, and that I can understand that as a political messaging approach. I just think it's led us to lose sight of the fact that in fact the major impacts of climate, that the really difficult to deal with things are not at all like what we're looking at now. It's if the West Antarctic ice sheet collapses and then in 50 years, sea levels are up by a meter and a half or 2 meters, right? That's something where like now tens of millions of people have to move. And that's not, oh, did you see there's the storm that seems to be coming a little bit more often than before, or gosh, it's hot and uncomfortable now. No, this is like really civilization altering stuff. It's politically, it's seen as politically demobilizing, to say the truth, which is that this stuff is coming much more for future generations than for ourselves, but it remains true.
Exactly, okay. So before we continue, how would you introduce yourself?
Well, I am a journalist, so what I focus on is how to talk about these difficult and complicated things in ways that make sense to people. I'm not a climate scientist, although I work with climate scientists every day, and I try to read as much climate research as I can. So yeah, but I don't want to overstate my direct knowledge chops. I know what people tell me.
Okay. So how would your report look like from the Brazil summit that recently ended?
Well, I didn't go to Brazil. I didn't go to Belém. I don't go to COPs because I mostly think COP is a waste of time. I mean, I think the UN process was probably well intentioned at first, but it just works off of the wrong kind of mental model about how climate outcomes come about. They tend to imagine it as a thing that governments can just decide by policy. Like there's some kind of dial in your national capital and you can turn it up, and then there's more emissions, so you can change policy and turn it down. But it's really nothing like that. Emissions are the outcomes of billions of decisions that everyone inside of society is making, trading off lots of different things. And so the things that actually ultimately determine emissions trajectories don't really have very much to do with what happens at UN negotiations. It has to do much more with how technologies change. And so I just think our time is much better spent doing these other things. I don't think comp is destructive or anything. It's just misdirection is the way I see it.
Okay. Uh, so how do you see the main factors in actually making a difference, changing something,
Yeah.
getting
I mean,
somewhere?
it's important to understand that we've been decarbonizing. So when I say we in the developed countries in Western Europe, North America, Japan, have been decarbonizing slowly, but emissions are what 15% down from their peak in 2007. So right before the financial crisis in 2008, emissions in the rich countries peaked, and they've been decarbonizing slowly since then. But in fact, if you look at how much carbon it took to produce $1 worth of GDP, we've been decarbonizing actually at quite a steady rate since the 1960s. This is one reason I think the UN process is kind of a misdirection, is that the rate of decarbonization hasn't actually accelerated because of COP. Um, we were decarbonizing on a per GDP basis already in the 60s and 70s. Why? Because fuel is expensive, and as engines got better and light bulbs got better, businesses and households would naturally prefer to spend less money on fuel. And so technology has been getting more efficient at a kind of steady rate since the 60s. That's good news. Unfortunately, that steady rate of decarbonization is not fast enough to get us to the kinds of greenhouse gas levels that are consistent with a stable atmosphere. And then the other thing is that the proportion of emissions that come from the rich countries is been falling really for since the 1970s, more or less monotonically. So it used to be that two-thirds of emissions came from the rich countries and one-third from the developed countries. And now it's the opposite. Now it's two-thirds, a little more than two-thirds comes from developing countries and one-third from the developed countries. And in developing countries, and particularly in China, they have been rising very quickly, especially between 2000 and 2015. Chinese emissions just exploded. At this point, China produces more greenhouse gases than all the developed countries put together, which is something I don't think people realize. We hear so much about solar energy, which is great in China, but people don't understand that the speed at which the electric market and the energy market in general and the concrete production and urbanization has been going in China, meat production has been so fast. So, in fact, the Chinese now account for more emissions than all of the developed countries, also, but for more emissions than all of the other developing countries combined. Yeah, it's something I've been wanting to write more about to a degree that we seldom think about. Really, the story of climate change this century is the story of Chinese very fast industrialization based on coal.
How do you view um, or how what kind of solutions do you propose or do people propose to make sure that these less developed countries become more developed without using too much fossil fuels?
Yeah. I mean that is sort of a big question. There's been a big push towards getting developing countries to skip over fossil fuels and go to renewables, to solar and wind. Um, I tend to think that this is likely to work less well than people are quite realizing. And the reason, well, there are many reasons. For one thing, solar and wind have this intermittency problem. They come and go with the weather and with the sunset, which means that they end up being quite unstable and they require these very high tech, sophisticated grids that are not easy to operate, and that many of the today's poorest countries, that we're really talking about Africa, where this is the biggest problem, would have
Mm.
a difficult time financing and operating a grid like that. You can't get industrial process heat out of solar and wind. There are types of energy, there are types of industrial development that require high heat output. So you just can't do it with solar and wind. So um, and the other thing that we see is that because of the intermittency, well, what's happened in China is that you've had this huge explosion in renewable energy, but because it's intermittent, they've had to backstop it with coal, right? So you see this parallel fast expansion of the least and the most polluting sources of energy in China at once. So we sort of think at Anthropocene Institute, where I'm director of climate repair, we tend to think that that's a false start. That what makes much more sense is to get much more serious about nuclear power, which is zero emissions, takes almost no land, doesn't require these critical minerals that are in short supply and that are mined in very bad conditions throughout Africa, and can sustain high heat output. Um, we think we've really missed a trick in excluding nuclear power from carbon crediting schemes. Right now,
Why has it been excluded and why has it been neglected for so long?
well, we think often about this concept of the green halo. So this like halo effect around solar and wind, it looks great on a PowerPoint presentation and in a
Mhm.
billboard and in a magazine. It makes people feel virtuous and warm and fuzzy. So they tend to think that is good, clean power. Nuclear power doesn't make people feel like that. Nuclear power, there's still this vestige from the 1960s and 70s of the anti-nuclear movement in Germany, especially, but throughout the developed countries, and this really irrational fear of radiation, even though in fact even in the worst nuclear accidents, nuclear radiation fallout has accounted for many fewer deaths than just a normal coal plant
Yeah.
would produce. So it's not rational at all. It's just solar and wind make people feel good and make corporate PR departments look good, and nuclear doesn't. So we think it's really time for a course correction. We think if you could issue carbon credits to nuclear power plants to recognize the mitigation outcomes that you get from adopting nuclear power, the economics of nuclear power from the point of view of an African country would be completely transformed. Suddenly, it would be possible for Kenya and Uganda and Cote d'Ivoire and Zimbabwe to start thinking about installing nuclear plants. And then they would have new avenues open for development that is zero carbon and is much safer. It's the other thing that I think is really lost in the melee and that people don't realize is that the new fourth generation nuclear power designs that are being developed now are at the same time much safer, like fundamentally safe, incapable of melting down on the one hand, but at the same time produce up to 99% less waste, because they're just entirely much more efficient. With appropriate regulation, they could be also much cheaper than existing power sources. It's just that we're stuck using these nuclear power designs, these pressurized water reactors, and these light water reactors that were designed from the 1950s, right? So we're using nuclear power designs that were designed by people using slide rules without computers, without advanced materials, and even they are cost competitive with fossil fuels now. So just imagine if we got serious about developing these fourth generation nuclear reactors, we would be looking at just a much better technology. There's now a boom. There are over 100 new reactor designs coming up through development. None of them are in production right now, which is why this all feels slightly woo-woo when you hear about it. But over the next 5, 10 years, some of these companies are going to start to get licensed, are going to start to produce power. And I think we're in the next 20 years and for a generational shift in the way we think about nuclear power as the old anti-nuclear generation from the anti-nuclear weapons times ages out of this debate. And new people come up and realize, wait a minute, that this is a much better solution than backstopping a solar panel with a coal power plant, which is what China is doing.
Yeah. So you said that you don't think the UN has a big role here. If we're supposed to go from these fossil fuels to like nuclear energy, what role do you see the government and the private sector? How do you differentiate?
Well, first, nuclear regulation has been stuck in this mindset from the 1960s where people really needed triple and quadruple and quintuple redundancies and far over engineered like nuclear containment domes, which drive up costs throughout the life of a project. So nuclear power ends up being perceived as being costly, but what people don't realize is that these costs are mostly driven by regulatory environment that has been we all want nuclear power to be cautiously regulated, but at some point it becomes so ludicrously over-regulated that it becomes impossible to drive down costs. So it takes several years to get a nuclear reactor design license in the United States or in France or in most developed countries. Sweden is a exception, in fact, but in most places it really takes a long time. So you have to submit these very detailed designs to a regulator that will take several years to go over them. And then, if in the process of building the plant, you realize that you have a fire hydrant in a place that doesn't make a lot of sense and you want to move it 30 centimeters to the left, you need to resubmit the entire design to begin recertification from scratch.
Yeah.
And so that will add billions of dollars of costs, and then you get these cost overruns, and then you get nuclear critics saying, "Well, see, nuclear is too expensive." It's not that nuclear is expensive; it's that nuclear regulatory culture is completely inadequate to the task in most countries. So we need regulators that are much more sane, that understand the inherent safety improvements of new generation nuclear designs, We need governments actually have been behaving pretty well about this, except for the Germans. We have a problem with the Germans, really. But in the United States, in France, in even in Belgium recently, we've seen changes in policies. In Finland, we've seen in South Korea and Japan, we've seen a new openness to policy to push forward nuclear innovation.
There's even talk in Norway about building
Is that
small
right?
modular reactors. Yeah.
I can't wait. I mean, we don't know which of these companies is going to end up being the winner, but hopefully it'll be one of yours, right? Um,
Yeah.
but the other place where we really need a change is in international financial institutions. We've started to see that. The World Bank had a policy in place since the 1960s where they would not consider an investment in nuclear power in developing countries. That policy was finally changed last year after years of lobbying, right? And people asking them to reconsider. But they said, well, they will now consider nuclear investments. They still don't consider nuclear to be clean energy because that is a different policy shift. So these organizations are big lumbering beasts that take a long time and lots of bureaucratic processes to change their official stances. And we're slowly getting there. Once you have a way of financing nuclear development in the developing world, and once you have ways of crediting the mitigation outcomes that you get out of nuclear power, people are going to see that this is just a better way to make power. It's just more reliable, it's cleaner, it's less expensive, it's just better in every way. And then, there will, of course, still be some use cases for solar and wind, but solar and wind are never really reliably going to be more than 40 or maximum 50% of a grid simply because the sun goes down, right? And battery storage costs, they have been coming down, but they haven't been coming down anywhere near fast enough. I always have to put an asterisk here in the conversation because there is a possibility that there is some kind of fundamental shift in battery technology with these solid state batteries that companies like Toyota have been trying to develop for 30 years. They haven't managed it after tens of billions of dollars of investment, but they might. Solid
Mm,
state batteries, if they ever do work, would make everything I just said kind of irrelevant because then solar would definitely win the race.
yeah. Just out of curiosity, what is the climate footprint of a solar panel and a battery, like during the life? How long do they last, and what's the difficulties with when they're when they're done?
Well, I am a little bit unwilling to talk too much about this because this I'm really not an expert on. I understand that battery recyclability has been getting really good, but that's for like the old lithium ion batteries, which are I don't think ever going to be as good as a nuclear power plant. I don't think that's so much the issue. There's even some people have proposed that you could end up in a situation where you could really get close to a circular economy with batteries. So I know that's not the bit of it that I'm most concerned with.
I see. So you mentioned that you work at the Anthropocene Institute.
That's right.
Can you explain what the Anthropocene means?
Well, we're in the new geological era. If all human beings died tomorrow, and a new intelligent race developed 1 million years from now, they would be able to date us just from the geological record because we have now created enough disruption in the geologic structure of time that our imprint on the planet is now probably forever. So at Anthropocene Institute, we call it that because we have this sense. Well, this is an American saying: if you break it, you fix it. You go to one of these pottery shops and you break an ornament. Well, now you have to pay for it. Well, with the climate, with so much of nature, humanity has kind of broken it. So now it's our job, it's our responsibility to take corrective actions to make sure that we stop breaking it and that we start repairing some of the damage that we've already done. So stopping breaking it definitely means shifting to forms of power generation that are not going to continue to wreck the atmosphere and cause mass biodiversity loss and mass die-offs in the ocean. And repairing it, well, it means hopefully taking positive actions to make things better.
Yeah. And why is the ocean the most powerful and underused? tool in climate repair.
Yeah, this is something we often think about. The ocean is thousands of times more massive than the atmosphere. The way we think about it sometimes is that the atmosphere is the afterthought of oceanic processes, right? So all the oxygen in the atmosphere initially was put there by phytoplankton, by ocean microorganisms. Most of the heat that is being trapped is being stored not in the atmosphere, but in the ocean, right? The biggest potential for absorption and reabsorption of greenhouse gases is not really on land where it's tapped out. You know, the biosphere on land can't really absorb that much more carbon, but the ocean can. So we we advocate a way of thinking about the climate crisis that treats the atmosphere as kind of the little brother of the ocean, and we want to create a mindset shift when it comes to atmospheric gases towards people understanding that once you've figured out the oceanic processes, the atmosphere will follow.
I see. So, what does it mean? What does ocean fertilization mean?
Well, it means a lot of things. So the most important reason that oceans absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is that they photosynthesize. Water is basically alive. Not literally alive, but if you take a cup of water from anywhere in the surface layer of the ocean, or a lake, or a stream, or a puddle, even anywhere in the world, you will have millions of living photosynthetic organisms in that cup. They're called phytoplankton. They are basically microscopic plants. We tend not to think about them because, again, they don't have a green halo. You take a picture of a rainforest, and that looks excellent in a PowerPoint presentation. A phytoplankton, you can't even see it, right? So, and then if you take some seaweed, well, maybe if you like sushi, you're into that, but people don't necessarily associate seaweed with climate virtue, right? So a lot of what we do at Anthropocene comes back to saying, look, we need to be smarter about this. We need to be less emotionally driven. We can't just like do the things that make us feel virtuous, because then we end up distorting our response to the climate crisis. There are responses that are maybe less emotionally satisfying, but that just make more sense. So,
Mm,
um, ocean fertilization is this idea that dates back to the 1980s, really, of understanding that there could be much more phytoplankton in the ocean than there is, and the reason that the phytoplankton concentrations in the ocean are not as high as they might be is simply that large parts of the ocean just don't have key nutrients that it would take for these microscopic plants to grow. So there's been a lot of emphasis over the year on iron, because iron is, well, it's an essential nutrient for all living things. You need iron as much as a phytoplankton does, but in especially far from coast, usually if you're near a coast, the ocean gets plenty of iron just from dust from land. Dust blowing off the land hits the ocean, and dust has not a lot of iron, but phytoplankton don't need a lot of iron. It's just a little bit goes a long way. But as you get farther from land, as you get towards the Southern Ocean, around Antarctica, towards the Arctic Ocean, places like that, you get large sections of the ocean, also in the Central Oceans, that just don't have enough iron. And so they tend to have much less phytoplankton. And phytoplankton, they're the primary producers in the oceans. So they're the first things that take light from the sun, turn that into energy, turn that into food, then bigger animal like zooplankton can eat, and then that small fish depend on, and then that bigger fish depend on, and squid and krill and whales and marine birds and all the other living things in the ocean depend ultimately on the productivity of phytoplankton. And you have large areas of the ocean where there's just not a lot of it. um, there are many reasons why that's the case, and we have good reason to think that there used to be much more,
mhm.
which is something else that people don't quite understand, is that, as a result of industrial whaling in the 19th century, but going into this century, and especially in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, we killed hundreds of thousands and millions of whales each year. right? And this ended up with a situation where whales, believe it or not, were an important part of the nutrient cycling processes that brought nutrients from the deep ocean up to the surface ocean. This is called the whale pump. You should absolutely Google this if you're interested in this topic. It's fascinating because whales eat many whale species feed in nutrient rich waters thousands of meters down from the surface, and then they do their business. They do number two up near the surface of the ocean, and so they're bringing those nutrients up to the surface
Mm.
layer where there's sunlight and where phytoplankton can reproduce. If you kill millions of whales, suddenly there's much less nutrient cycling going on. So one of the ideas that has been around for a long time has been to reestablish the nutrient balance in the surface ocean by bringing iron the way whales would have to the surface ocean. Um, but it's not only iron. There are other nutrients too that we can talk about.
So, what does the science from previous trials show?
Mm. So there were 13 trials done in the 1990s. I think the latest one was done in 2012. These trials were usually done in cold waters, so in waters where the only limiting nutrient was iron. And they tended to show that if you add a little bit of iron to waters that are otherwise high in nutrients, you very quickly get large blooms of phytoplankton, big enough that the crews on these boats could smell them within like half an hour of putting iron into the ocean. And you could clearly see the signal from space, from satellites. This was like not at all subtle. What these trials tended to show, though, as well, is that it wasn't a very good way. That was turned out not to be a very good way of storing carbon dioxide for the long term, because although these tiny plants would grab the carbon dioxide and capture it, they would then get eaten by zooplankton, by other plants, and by small ocean animals, and through cellular respiration, well, that same CO2 would come out again, and because these cold oceans are well mixed or churning oceans, the CO2 would come into contact with the atmosphere, and most of it would be outgassed again very, very quickly. So within a few
Okay.
months, you are sort of back to where you had started. So it was a suggestive thing. It was definitely not a solution. There are now at Anthropocene, we're now backing a different approach to ocean fertilization that focuses on warm waters and tropical waters. And we think that the biogeochemistry there is sufficiently different that the potential to store to get long-term storage should be better. But that's very early sort of experimental work. Uh, I think the bigger point here is that you can be very, very into climate change as a topic and think that you're well read on it. And you've probably heard not much more than what I just said about ocean fertilization. It's kind of a niche thing. It's like a few researchers thinking about it. But at Anthropocene, our idea is that the ocean rules and the atmosphere follows, right?
Mm.
And so we should have a completely different conversation about climate where we should have thousands of people meeting in Brazil, not to talk about some lame carbon dioxide limit that nobody's going to follow, but to talk about the actual global research plan to figure out how to get phytoplankton to absorb carbon dioxide to the extent that is needed to stabilize the planet's climate. I mean, we think this is possible. If you had a kind of, imagine if you had like a Manhattan Project like mobilization of scientific capacity, right? If you had thousands of climate scientists from all over the world with proper resources trying to work out a way to capture carbon dioxide in the deep ocean using ocean photosynthesis, of course we would get there. And this
Yeah.
would likely be much less expensive and much less disruptive and much less divisive than the climate politics we have now.
If I understood it correctly, I think this climate summit was the first time the ocean has been recognized as a central part of climate action, at least.
Sort of, although you'd be surprised to find out that in the original UN Framework Convention on Climate Change way back in 1992, the parties to the UNFCCC did recognize the need to develop their ocean carbon sink. So this is an idea the scientists have always known about. It's
Yeah.
just that it was sort of forgotten because climate politics became this contest to see who could demonize fossil fuel makers the most and who could sort of virtue signal the most and get the biggest green halo. The climate debate became very, very emotional, and it became about signaling your human priorities, and we just
Yeah.
lost sight of the biogeochemical processes that ultimately determine what's in the atmosphere.
So, what are the biggest unknowns you think you will discover during these trials?
Oh boy, there's a lot. So when you go to warm waters, you find a more complicated situation because it's not just iron that's missing, it's also nitrates, so fixed nitrogen compounds, and phosphates, phosphorus compounds. We think we can induce nitrate fixation in the ocean because just in the very same way that the legumes in your back garden will fix atmospheric nitrogen and turn it into fertilizer, basically, there are closely related organisms in the ocean that do the same thing. They're called diacetrophs. They basically they're nitrogen eaters. They take nitrogen from the ocean and build it into ammonium. So the first thing that we're interested in finding out is to what extent can we actually build nitrogen fertilizer in the ocean just by feeding these nitrogen fixers. We want to find out to what extent can nitrogen fixation alone drive carbon dioxide drawdown, or to what extent are you going to also need phosphates. We want to understand what this does to oxygen concentrations deeper down the water column, because anytime you have more phytoplankton up top, some of them will be eaten, and some of that will drive deoxygenation processes down below, farther down the water column. So I imagine for a lot of your listeners, this is all gets like very confusing and technical, but that's what we're getting at. That's exactly the point. Is that this is a conversation that has been really confined to a few specialists in ocean science departments and universities around the world, and that people in the broader climate world just don't have any clue about it because they haven't got
Mm.
used to talking about it, right? So we want to broaden that conversation, and we want to make the climate conversation about these topics, because these are the topics that it will take to actually get the oceans to capture the tens of billions of tons of carbon dioxide that we're putting into the atmosphere each year. So right now we're putting about 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Land sinks are absorbing about 12 of those, and ocean sinks about another 9, but that still leaves like 19, 20, 25, depending on whether it's an El Nino year, depending on ocean conditions, between 20 to 25 billion tons that are being added to the atmosphere every year. The only logical place that those can be stored safely and quickly enough to make a climate difference is in the ocean. And the only like reasonably sensible way to get them there is through photosynthesis. So this is a conversation. This is what the climate debate should be about, and not do you drive a Tesla or an internal combustion engine car.
How far down do you have to drive that number, billion tons, before it makes a difference?
Well, the UN's RCP 2.5 gets very technical, but the emissions trajectory that the UN thinks that we would need to be on to get to net zero by the middle of the century includes about 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide capture per year. So
Okay.
all of the other proposed avenues for carbon dioxide capture now cost either hundreds or even more than $1,000 per ton. That is too much. So if you're trying to having to do 10 billion tons at $1,000 a ton, that's $10 trillion a year. That's 10 times the Pentagon's budget. That is a nonsense number. Nobody, there's no way to finance that. We need carbon dioxide removal not at $1,000 a ton, not even at $100 a ton, but at $10 a ton. If carbon dioxide removal costs $10 a ton, then absorbing 20 billion, it's just math, right? 20 billion tons of carbon dioxide could then be removed for $200 billion. Well, the world is now spending about $1 trillion, so 5 times that much, on climate in general, on climate mitigation and adaptation. So if we could get the technology to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at $10 a ton, then we could save 80% of the money that we're spending currently on dealing with climate and get to net zero next year. Right? This is just it's just mathematically the logical way to do it. And the back of the envelope calculations that the teams that we're working with at Anthropocene have done show that this is probably doable, quite doable.
I asked you about unknowns. What about unintended consequences?
For sure, for sure. I mean, part of what we are trying to develop at Anthropocene is a method for developing these techniques, and we think that the smart way to think about it is to think use a parallel of the way we develop medicines, right? When you're developing a new medicine to deal with some kind of human disease, well, you're doing something kind of scary at some point because you're taking a new compound that's never been inside a human body before and you're putting it inside a human body and you don't exactly, you have some guess of what it will do, but you don't exactly know what it will do. So some people would want us to say, well, we don't know what these fertilization protocols will do to the ocean, so we shouldn't do it at all. But that's a little
Mm,
bit like saying, well, we don't know what a new drug is going to do to a human body, so we shouldn't develop any new medicines. That is nonsense. Nobody thinks that seriously. Instead, what we do is we have computer models of what a molecule will do in a body, and then you run it through that, and then if it shows promise, then you do it on animal subjects, or you do it on a petri dish, or you do it in the lab at first, and then if that seems like it'll be safe and effective, then you find a few very sick people and you give it to them, and you monitor for safety and effectiveness. You have a series of stage gates, right? And at each stage gate, you stop and you evaluate, did this work, did this make this do something that we weren't expecting it to do, and if it seems to be working, you go on, and if it doesn't, you stop and you reevaluate and you redesign the trial, and then you start again from the beginning. So we have ways of managing unexpected and unknown unknowns. We have developed very elaborate protocols for doing this. We just need to apply them to ocean biogeochemistry in a sensible way, being, sometimes when you talk about ocean fertilization, when the idea is new to people, they get the sense that you're going to go from proposing it as an idea to full scale deployment all in one go. That would be insane. Nobody's proposing that. Nobody in this field is crazy. Okay, we're all
mm,
sane people. There are a lot of very serious ocean scientists in this space thinking hard about the logical way to do this. And the logical way to do this is through stage gates in the same way that you do when you're developing a new medicine.
yeah. So why is 2027 critical year to get this going?
Oh, we just need a time frame that makes sense. We don't want to get stuck into a mindset where you're just doing lab trials forever and ever and ever. We understand that we're in a short timeline here, right? Like we continuing to add 20 gigatons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere each year and saying, oh, we can do 10 years of research and maybe start to do an in situ trial in 2035 is would lack the urgency that is appropriate to the situation. We are facing mass die-offs and mass biodiversity loss now. We're facing many more heat waves now that are making agriculture impossible in places like sub-Saharan Africa and parts of the Indian subcontinent as well as Latin America. So these are pressing problems. If we are going to get to the stage where we are able to begin to scale up the interventions, we need in situ trials by 2027, which means that we need to do the laboratory research right now. And so we're working with groups that are doing this right now, or we're pushing forward towards trying to get some in situ trials in place in 2027. And then if those go well, we could be scaling up in the ocean by 2030, 32. And then by 2035, we can be at that multi-gigaton scale carbon dioxide removal that then does make something like the UN's low carbon emissions trajectory feasible, right? Because just talking about it or going to conferences in Brazil about it is not going to do the trick.
I'm guessing there are some government scientists, NGOs, public opinion that are slowing this down.
Yeah, I thought so too at first. That's what I expected. I know 15 years ago this stuff was quite controversial, and there were certainly some people mobilized against it. There are still, of course, some people who are leery about it, which is correct. I mean, we should all be leery about adding new things to the ocean, and we should be leery about people who do it without proper safeguards. But the world has changed in the last 15 years. When I talk to environmental advocacy activists and environmental organizations, eh, I don't find a very negative opinion climate anymore. I think the opinion climate has changed, and I think maybe we've been slow to register that change because people understand that the emergency will bite. And I
Mm.
also, in a weird way, I feel like having Donald Trump in the White House almost helps in that any fantasy that we're going towards rapid emissions collapses because of political decisions has now been done away with. Like the political track is not going to be the way we solve this. So then once people understand that kind of scenario is no longer viable, naturally they ask, well, what else can we do? And some people want to do things like stratospheric injection of sulfur dioxide to reflect sunlight. Um, things that sound kind of scary and are kind of scary in some ways. And at Anthropocene, our position is that we're not there yet. Like we hopefully will never get there yet. Before we even start to talk about that, we should talk about these other approaches that are much more gentle on the ecosphere and that will not create the kinds of divisions and arguments that something like solar geoengineering would produce.
Yeah. So do you think probably it would be irresponsible not to test this at a larger scale?
Well, I mean, it would be irresponsible not to test it at a small scale first, right? Like we need to crawl before we walk. Um, what we don't want to do is we don't want to go faster than the science can guarantee the safety, right? Because
Yeah.
what we really can't afford is some kind of screw up where we go to an in-ocean trial that's not been properly thought through and it has some downstream impact. Maybe you have a harmful algal bloom. Maybe you damage a sensitive fishery in a way that you didn't understand that would be possible. And then you've set research back 10 years. So part of the point of this stage-gated approach that mimics the drug development is precisely to ensure that progress is as fast as it can be, but no faster.
Yeah. Then how do you see a possibility of this ocean fertilization becoming a profit-driven geoengineering industry?
I mean, some people are trying it already. There's a company out there called Gigablue, which is trying something like this in New Zealand. Look, I sort of don't care if it's for profit or non-profit as long as it works. The initiative that we are pursuing in at Anthropocene Institute is a non-profit initiative because there are some international agreements that do suggest that they have some signature. They're not enforced yet, the London Protocol, but the signatories have committed to doing this on a non-commercial basis. And we're at an early enough stage in the science that we think it makes sense to do it on a non-profit basis. To the extent that anyone does profit, it should be the countries in whose territorial waters we're doing this. And we'd mostly be talking about well, they used to be called small island developing states. Now they're called big oceanic nations or big oceanic states because they look small on the map, but they account for a lot of ocean in the
Yeah.
Pacific. Biogeochemically is where it makes most sense to do it. And these are some of the most threatened, most vulnerable, most exposed nations in the world. So instead of your small or your big oceanic nations being seen as passive victims of climate change, we'd much rather partner with them to use the thing that they really have, which are these big oceans, and explore the way that they can fight back against climate change. And if any income comes out of this, we think it should go to them first.
Yeah. How do you view the ordinary man's responsibility in fighting this climate change or climate repair?
I don't think the ordinary person has any responsibility. I know it's a little bit of an extreme position that I take on this. I think that the drive to moralize climate change has actually done immense damage because it's turned it into a virtue contest and into a like, who is a better human being, you or me? Um, I'm going to take the guilt out of climate, and that means depersonalizing it, treating it as what it is, which is an atmospheric chemistry problem that needs to be solved through interventions that are punctual, that try to be low cost and as gentle as possible, which is what we're working on. We think the ordinary person has much better things to do. I shouldn't say we think, I think the ordinary person has much better things to do day to day than worry about climate change. This is not a problem that should be everybody's problem.
I think people are relieved to hear that. But what gives you hope and what keeps you up at night?
Oh, I'm the only person I know who got into climate change and then ended up feeling much more hopeful about the world. And like, I don't know, when you really, really understand the potential of ocean photosynthesis and phytoplankton as a carbon dioxide removal method, it's hugely empowering because I know I don't have any climate dread. This is a solvable problem. This is a problem that we absolutely, as a species, can solve. It's just we're a little bit behind the ball. I don't think we should blame anyone for us being behind the ball. It's a really unprecedented problem. Like this is nothing like this has ever happened to the human species before, and it's super confusing. It happens on scales that don't make sense to people day to day. It's normal that we're confused by it. I think we should have a little bit more sort of self-compassion that we've sort of fumbled the first couple of decades of this, but now it's time to course correct. Now it's time to understand that we need to be pragmatic. We need to capture the carbon dioxide and put it in the deep ocean where it belongs. In fact, when you think about it, the carbon dioxide that's coming up into the air is getting there because we're burning oil. But what is oil is just ancient phytoplankton that settled and was compressed and became
Yeah.
oil. So we're just closing that cycle. It's something we can do and we will do. And I am convinced that in by my grandchildren and especially my great grandchildren's time, um, climate change is going to be something that a few historians read about in history, in a historic context about this potential crisis that really freaked people out. That thankfully in the 2020s and 2030s and especially in the 2040s, we got on top of through these new technologies, and that is now no longer a problem. I'm sure that we're going to have many problems in the year 2100, but I really don't think climate change is going to be one of them because we can fix it.
Yeah. I'd like to ask you about Björn Lomborg's work, if you've read him, and what your thoughts are about his stance.
Oh, I'd rather not comment because I did read him, but it was a few years back, and it's not super fresh in my memory. I mean, I think it's okay, but my sense is that I don't want to comment too much because I really have not read him recently enough. But what I remember thinking as I read him is, well, here's another person who hasn't quite understood how much better new generation nuclear is to what we've had before.
I see. Last question.
Okay.
What is the meaning of life?
You got to make it for yourself, man. That's what I'm doing. For me, it goes through phytoplankton and making sure my great grandchildren think their great grandfather was a little bit weird because he was into working out this problem that nobody talks about anymore. But you got to work out your own. We each do.
Kiko, thank you for your time. It was interesting.
Thanks so much, Alexander.
Tusen takk for at du hørte på Bendiksen Airways. Dersom du har tips, kommentarer eller vil gi en vurdering av episoden, så gjør gjerne det. Det setter jeg stor pris på.